What would you recommend to somebody who's looking to just break out of that toxic pattern and begin to learn to retrain their brain to have a healthy relationship with dopamine?
For most of my patients, I will recommend that they identify their drug of choice. What is that substance or behavior that they continue to get caught in the addiction vortex, and to abstain from that for 30 days. It's not that 30 days is, going to solve all their problems, but it's like the amount of time our brains can sort of conceptualize, and we can anticipate it, we can plan for it, we can set a specific quit date, we can put our self-binding strategies in place. Now, if your drug of choice is something like food or sex, obviously you can't not eat, and we do consider sex to be a healthy part of, a flourishing life. But with food, what you can do is you can not eat processed food for a month or not eat sugar, and so you stick to certain categories of eatings, or you can stick to certain times of eatings, whatever you can do to help bring back or moderate your use. For something like sex, I actually recommend that people have no orgasms with themselves or others for that period of time, all in the pursuit of resetting reward pathways. And the idea is that when you get to 30 days, it's not as if all your problems will be solved, but at least you will have, changed your brain chemistry enough that then you can make data-informed decisions about how you want to use going forward. And if it's a drug like sex or food that we ultimately need to ingest, or, we consider eating and sexual behavior a part of a healthy lifestyle, then we need to be very specific about the plan. What are we going to use? What are we going to eat? What are we going to do sexually? How much, how often, who with, so that we can really begin to define what that healthy use looks like.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, because I've had friends who have had issues when it comes to pornography or sex and food, things that are maybe non-drug related. And one of the things that has often worked for them is, obviously you can't cut all that stuff out permanently, but it's learning how to reestablish healthy relationships with them, and then getting your dopamine receptors recalibrated to a point where when you introduce certain parts of those things back into your life, sex, and then also maybe having sugar processed foods, you're able to hopefully manage them in a healthier way, because now your dopamine receptors are kind of brought back to some baseline.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. It's this acknowledgement that we are animals, and that our ancient wiring, has evolved to have us consume as much of the good things that come our way as humanly possible. Because in a world of scarcity, you could never predict when you might not have more of that. But now, of course, we have an infinite supply of almost every reinforcing substance and behavior. And so it's a really hard world to live in, especially if we have that kind of innate vulnerability to be over consumers, or to do things at, the maximum volume, so to speak. So I think acknowledging, the physiologic imperative or loop that we can get into, and then recognizing that it's not hopeless, and that truly by abstaining for long enough, we can reset reward pathways such that we're then re-entering engagement with that substance from a new place, from a healthier baseline, from a place of more resilience and ability to manage our consumption. Not that it's easy going forward from that. Again, we have to be very disciplined. We also have to be aware of what are the things that are stepping stones to our drug of choice. So for example, for me, as I write about in the book how I got addicted to erotic novels. And it was interesting to begin to observe after I did a dopamine fast from them, and then went back to using them, had the abstinence violation effect where I binged all weekend long, showed up at work, with no sleep, feeling horrible. And then actually had to give up those erotic novels for a year to really kind of feel like I could manage it again. Then discovered, going back to trying erotic novels, that it didn't do the trick, that I was going to need so much more potent drug to recapture that original, that I just sort of said, I'm not going to use that substance anymore, because I don't want to go to the place that I would have to go, to recapture it. But of course, so people with the disease of addiction, that's part of their disease, that they would be willing, that they have that nature, they would be willing to go very, very far. So, I think these are such things that can really present themselves in so many aspects of our life. So we always have to kind of be aware and monitor. It's a balancing act, right? It's a delicate balancing act, but it is possible.
If you could explain to the best of your ability, like what dopamine is, when is it released, and why it's important?
Okay, so dopamine is a chemical that we make in our brain. It has different functions in the brain. For example, it's very important for movement, and it's also essential for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. But I think at its broadest level, dopamine is a way that our brains signal to us that we need to pay more attention to the environment, and that we potentially need to either approach the stimulus in the environment or back away from it. And the reason I think that that's a better, broader way of understanding dopamine is because we can have a release of dopamine in response to things that are negative stimuli, as well as to things that we typically associate with a positive or rewarding experience. I think sometimes dopamine is mistakenly identified as the pleasure neurotransmitter, and it is important to the experience of pleasure, but not just pleasure. Novelty in and of itself, so anything new in the environment, even if it's potentially negative, will get our brains to release dopamine in response. And of course, it's no coincidence that dopamine is important, not just for these stimuli in the environment, but also for movement, because those things are intertwined, from an evolutionary perspective, because most organisms will have to either move toward or move away from whatever the stimulus is. And if you think about the purpose of like hormones and neurotransmitters in our brains, the fundamental purpose at its most basic level is to trigger some kind of physical movement or physical action or physical response. I sometimes think that reducing it down to that fundamental can be very helpful, because so much of our modern life is sedentary. We are not moving, right? We are having these interactions on the internet at the tip of a finger, and yet our bodies really want to move in response to those. So I think reconceptualizing dopamine as a signal for some kind of movement toward the stimulus can be a kind of a helpful, broader way to think about it.
Yeah, that's so well said and very well explained. And I learned something new like every time I talk to you, and that definitely put things in a different perspective for me, because you're right. Like dopamine often gets associated with just being like the molecule that's associated with pleasure, but it's also associated with pain. And that's why things like drugs, alcohol, and other addictions are closely related to our relationship with dopamine. As far as like what happens in a real-time situation with dopamine, the way I understand it, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, is that like say that I am going to do something, like let's just say that I'm addicted to drugs and I am super excited to go score some drugs. Like dopamine, as I understand it, is what's getting me excited and moving towards seeking that rush, that high, that chase. And then once I get the drug and do it and come down off the high, it almost feels like there's no more dopamine. You don't feel good anymore. Like, can you see that a lot? Like if somebody goes and cheats on their partner, like they'll have the same kind of response, or they spend a bunch of money that they didn't like want to spend. Like it's always like the chase feels good, and then once you've got it, you feel like crap. So like what's going on like in the brain, and why do people feel like that?
Right. So let's break it apart in a couple different pieces. So there's the piece about anticipating our reward. And we can only anticipate our reward if we've learned that it is reinforcing or rewarding for us because we've done it in the past. And this gets to the heart of what people talk about when they talk about addiction as a learned behavior, because that is the element of learning. Our brain remembers our reaction in the past to that stimulus. Unfortunately, what our brain tends to remember is some of the earliest exposures to that drug. We're very bad at remembering the sort of negative downstream consequences, which in and of itself is really interesting, right? That we have this vivid, acute memory of the early reinforcing effects of our early drug use, but are almost amnestic for the sort of negative consequences of drug use. But importantly, once we've learned to associate that behavior or that substance with feeling good or feeling some kind of reinforcing, feeling, then when we think about that drug or when we anticipate using that drug, we're already getting an increase in dopamine firing. So remember that dopamine, we're always firing dopamine at a kind of baseline tonic level. Then when we are reminded of our drug, a trigger, or we're anticipating using that drug, we get an increase. The point being that we're already a little bit high anticipating that drug. Now we have to do, the work of going to get it. But here's a key piece. Right after we have that increase in dopamine firing as we're anticipating the drug, immediately that's followed by a decrease in dopamine firing, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels. So our anticipation or our recall of drug use alone triggers this dopamine deficit state, which then drives the craving. So once we've anticipated the drug use or been reminded of the drug use, we get a little bit high, then we get that dopamine deficit state, and now we're sort of caught in the clutches of the incredibly strong physiologic urge to get dopamine firing at least back to baseline. So very hard once we've put ourselves in that state or been put in that state accidentally to resist the compelling drive to restore baseline dopamine firing. So that's the first piece of it. Now we're craving, we go get it. Like there's no slowing down that train, right? We go and we get it. We only remember like the euphoric recall of using. We use it. And if we're in the early stages of our addiction, when we use, we will get an even bigger increase in dopamine release with ingestion of our drug, right? But what happens over time is that we develop tolerance. So over time with repeated use, we develop tolerance, meaning that we need more potent forms of our drug to get the same effect. And if we are using enough for long enough, essentially our brain learns that drug to the extent that we get zero bump with actual ingestion. So again, we anticipate the drug, we get a little bit of dopamine release above baseline, followed by a dopamine deficit state. That's craving, that drives the work to do it. Now we're expecting a big dopamine increase with drug ingestion, but because our brains have changed our hedonic or joy set point, we no longer get that big increase. Instead, we get a tiny little bump or maybe no bump at all. We actually go into the dopamine deficit state immediately or get the opposite. So that's really important because if there's one thing that will send our brains into a dopamine nosedive, it's anticipating a reward that doesn't come, right? So we thought that using would bring about a certain feeling. We don't get that feeling we were anticipating. So we use more and more potent forms. We add something else to it, just trying to recapture that feeling. But we're not going to be able to recapture it because our brains have already adjusted our hedonic set point and we're in this kind of chronic dopamine deficit state. And what will really recapture good feelings is to abstain from our drug for long enough for our brains to start to upregulate and make our own dopamine and dopamine receptors again. So that's why abstinence, sustained abstinence is so important. Probably not even just from our drug of choice, but also from drugs generally, right? Because all drugs end up triggering the same dopamine reward pathway. I hope that I explained it. It was a little convoluted, but it's hard to do it without images.
When somebody is depressed and they're going through something like a breakup or some sort of loss where they're feeling down, is their dopamine levels being suppressed? And is that why they're seeking out these quick fixes to get like quick rushes of dopamine?
Yeah, so there's an interesting literature showing that people who struggle with chronic depression, who do not have addiction, they just have depression, that you will actually see decreased dopamine firing in key areas of their brain. So we do believe that sort of low baseline dopamine is a characteristic of the problem of depression. And in fact, again, what happens with addiction is that we essentially, because we're flooding our brains with too much dopamine, the brain compensates by downregulating dopamine transmission, and we then enter that depressive state. So that's why we say that addiction is the great mimic. Intoxication can look like mania, can look like psychosis, withdrawal can look exactly like depression. And it's hard to know, are you dealing with somebody who just has addiction and is going through this cycle, or someone who has addiction and depression? The bottom line is, because depression is this sort of, depressed, like literally dopamine depressed state, it's very natural for people in that state to want to reach for something to make themselves feel better. And epidemiologically, what we see is that people who struggle with disorders like depression are at greater risk for becoming addicted as a form of kind of self-medication, trying to get themselves out of that dark space. But what people usually don't notice, and this is what I keep trying to bring to the attention of my patients and my students and such, is that although the drug may initially work to bring us out of that, dopamine hole, over time, it puts us in an even deeper hole through this process of neuroadaptation, or gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance, as I talk about in my book. So it's such a cunning and deceptive path, because what initially works to bring us up actually becomes the source of our feeling worse in the long run. And therefore, and you add to that the fact that we don't remember that. So this thing that, makes us feel good initially, but makes us feel worse in the long run, all we remember is the feeling good part, and we can't see the feeling bad part. And that's where, telling stories or using words to describe our lived experience is so incredibly powerful, whether we're doing that with a therapist or a coach, or in a 12-step meeting, or with a friend. It's a way that we can bring to the surface what has really happened to us, what the real trajectory is, which otherwise we wouldn't see, right? But it's kind of that collective hippocampus or memory that we get from 12-step meetings, where we're reminded, oh yeah, that's right. That's what happens when I use that drug. When, if left to our own devices, it would be very hard to keep that vivid enough to direct behavior.
I mean, that's so well said. And I think that, like, one of the things that people struggle with is it's hard to not fall into the trap of instant gratification and finding these, quick, easy things that are unhealthy often to make us feel better. And what's super hard is us leaning into like things that can make us feel better, whether that's being around a good community of people, whether that's meditating, whether that's exercise. I know you talk about like when somebody's like thinking about like doing a drug that they are in recovery from, that they should do something hard and challenging, right? To help get through that. Like, what do you recommend for somebody who maybe isn't addicted to drugs, but they're just struggling with like this impulsiveness to make these behaviors and doing things that they would regret, whether it's spending money they don't have, whether it's sex, whether it's gambling, like, or what have you?
Yeah, so I really recommend, as you say, kind of leaning into pain. And that starts with just sitting with our uncomfortable feelings and not trying to do something to distract ourselves. Because no matter how fast we run, those feelings are going to catch up with us. So a much better thing to do is just sort of give up. In a way, this is sort of a surrender moment, and turn and face those uncomfortable feelings and just say, okay, I'm just going to sit through this. I'm going to tolerate this. Or I'm going to do something that's even harder than the pain of sitting with this, and I'm going to reach out to somebody and I'm going to talk to them, or I'm going to force myself to go outside and go for a walk and hope that I feel better after that. Or I'm going to force myself to pray or meditate, or any of these effortful things that we don't feel like doing, but that we have learned if we do them, we feel better afterwards. And again, that's also physiologic, right? This whole science of hormesis, this idea that by exposing ourselves to mild to moderate amounts of noxious stimuli, we actually start to make more of our own dopamine, which is what we want. Like we're in a dopamine deficit state. We want to restore homeostasis. The first way to do that is to abstain from our drug, but the other way to do that is to press harder on the pain side and allow our bodies to kind of respond by upregulating dopamine production. So it's all of these things, kind of tolerating the discomfort of just letting those feelings be, and realizing that we can withstand them, we can tolerate them, that we are strong enough for that, and then allowing our resilience to be a touchstone for us going forward. This idea that, well, I made it through that. I really am strong. I can make it through this, whatever this is.
just being able to sit in that discomfort and in that painful moment is like the key to everything, right? And it's often like very challenging when you have this urge to do something that might be legal and that you might be able to do, but deep down that you either shouldn't do it, or that after you do the thing, you're going to feel like 10 times worse than you were the moment you were sitting there, like trying to sit in that discomfort of not doing the thing. And with addiction, the symptoms of it, in many ways, it can be pretty obvious, between irritability, behavioral issues, there's trouble with relationships, to jobs. I can go on and on with examples of when typically, when you can maybe know when somebody might be having a hard time with an addiction. But like, how does the average person who is just like, ingrained in this impulsiveness where they're just spending money they don't have, sleeping around too much when they know they shouldn't be, or it's not healthy for them, or maybe like on social media too much, like how does somebody know that their dopamine system is out of whack?
I think one of the best ways for the average person to sort of probe this question is to do a dopamine fast, to decide to not do that thing for a period of time and to see what happens. And people who are not severely addicted, are typically able to do that. They're able to say, okay, I'm not going to go on a Snapchat or Twitter for a period of time. I'm not going to go on this dating app for a period of time. I'm not going to eat this particular food for a period of time. And to just sort of self-observe, it's a great opportunity to practice mindfulness. That is to say, observing our thoughts and feelings without judgment, but also without trying to run away from them. So I think that is a good place to start, honestly, because when people feel better after a period of absence, and they're often surprised at how much better they feel, but they're also motivated then. They say to themselves, well, I hadn't thought that like doing Twitter was actually making me more depressed and anxious, but now that I stopped, I realize I feel better. And so I don't want to do Twitter going forward, or I don't want to do Twitter as much as I did before in the way that I did before. So, it sounds so basic and kind of simple, but I do think it's really important. The other thing, of course, is surrounding ourselves with other people who value this type of project. That is the project of limiting our consumption, which is not just, good for us, but also good for our environment, good for the planet. So, consistent with most people's values. And that feels good, right? Living in alignment with our values. Another piece of it that I think is really fundamental that we often don't talk about is just the ways in which we're so rushed in the modern world. And if we can just slow things down and give ourselves an opportunity to breathe and do things slowly, that sometimes in and of itself can be enough to sort of, okay, take a pause and let me really think about, do I want to do this thing, or, do I not want to do it? And so I think, again, giving ourselves permission to just slow it way, way down, to take a breath, to have some compassion for ourselves in this dopamine overloaded world, but also just like take things a lot slower for a few seconds or moments can be really helpful.
It's such great advice. And I think that like people just need to take that first step and develop the self-awareness, like you said, like in order to try to get better at whatever problem that might be going on in your life, you first have to develop the awareness that there is a problem, and then accepting it, surrounding yourself with people that have like-minded interests, common values, and that are focusing on bettering themselves too, and then like kind of working together collaboratively so that individually you can all heal from whatever it is you're going through and help make the world a better place. One of the things that is pretty common now is the addiction to like social media. Like I even find myself like setting limits on my phone for an hour a day or something on Instagram, but I find myself ignoring it most of the time and just saying, ignore for today. And then the barrier is off. What do things like Instagram and Facebook and other forms of social media, like what kind of impact do they have on our dopamine levels? And how can somebody have like a healthy relationship with social media?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that's important to acknowledge is that social media is a drug. It's a very potent releaser of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, exactly like, other drugs and alcohol and what have you. So it definitely is a potent reinforcer. And for people who have a propensity for addiction or who have a propensity for addiction to human intimacy and human contact, which is in and of itself healthy, to want human contact. But if your particular drug of choice tends to be this attachment, then social media has the possibility of being a very powerful addictive drug. So first, just recognizing that it's a drug, that it releases dopamine in the same part of the reward pathway as other traditional drugs. And then again, noticing how we're consuming that drug, if we're consuming it in an addictive way that's interfering with our values. And then, to have a healthy relationship with social media, I think it's important to take this period of time away, because what can happen is we get a very distorted perspective of the importance, or what we call the salience, of social media. And we begin to really live primarily in the virtual world, where all of our meaning gets derived from social media and our identity and our purpose. And the real world kind of disappears in that process. And that's a very dangerous phenomenon, I think, especially when you think about the metaverse is coming down the pike, this idea that we're going to 3D all be living in this, three-dimensional space. I think that's very, very dangerous, because we don't ultimately want to live in a space that we can entirely control. So this is a little bit more of a complicated idea. We think we want to control everything. We think we do. And we strive for that in our lives, controlling the way we feel, controlling what happens to us, to other people. But in fact, our happiest moments tend to be the moments where we don't have control, right? We're subjugated to something larger than ourselves, which is in a way what drugs do, right? That's why there's that appeal. We can forget ourselves when we're in the grips of drugs. But of course, drugs are sort of this false god. Social media can almost be like a false god too, like it's all powerful. But ultimately, that is not what is going to make us happy. We really do want to live in the real world, which is a world of unpredictability that we cannot control. That's the essence of the real world, as opposed to the virtual world, which on the face of it just sounds awful. Like, I don't want to, I'm terrified at the thought of not knowing what the next moment will bring, in small ways and in large ways. I think that I want to know, and I want to be able to control it, but that doesn't make us happy. What makes us ultimately happy is when we, again, surrender ourselves to the unfolding of our unpredictable lives, which is so paradoxical, but in fact, that is what makes us happiest. So this virtual world, it's like a world we can control. It's human made. It resembles real life enough that it seems like real life. We get caught up in it. We care about it. But ultimately, it's a false, it's an idol. It's really a false thing. And it doesn't make us happy.
Have you seen, or do you think that we will see or are seeing, like, a bunch of people that their brains are now wired for addiction before because of their excess social media use?
And not just social media, but all the kinds of reinforcing drugs and behaviors that are available to people now. I do think that it has changed our brains such that we can tolerate less pain. We need more stimuli in order to feel any pleasure at all. And when we're not using, we're in this state of sort of sub-threshold withdrawal. I do think that is what has happened to the modern human, which is, why many of us are endorsing that we're more miserable than ever. If you look at survey studies on happiness, what you'll see is that people are less happy today than they were 20 years ago. And the least happy people in the world live in the richest countries, with the United States topping that list, which is, completely ironic, because we have more of everything we ever wanted, and yet we're more unhappy. So I do really think that the modern mind has been, rewired or reprogrammed. It's not that we can't get back to a happier place, but I do think that, we're sort of all in this kind of dopamine deficit state as a result of this fire hose of dopamine. There's some interesting brain imaging work showing that when people are engaging in short-term or immediate rewards, the part of their brain that lights up most is the limbic area, or the reward pathway, which is those deeper, more primitive brain structures that are conserved across millions of years of evolution and species that are the same in the lizard as they are in the human. So we're essentially acting out of our lizard brain. Whereas when people are engaging in longer term delayed rewards that they have to do work for to get, the part of the brain that lights up is the prefrontal cortex, which is that gray matter area right behind our foreheads that's so important for delayed gratification, for storytelling, for appreciating future consequences. So it's possible that our prefrontal cortices are atrophying due to lack of use, and we're all being driven by this kind of lizard brain because we're just all about short-term rewards.
And it's like this vicious cycle too, because when we're stressed out, it kind of suppresses our prefrontal cortex as well, right? So if we're stressed and we're not able to think cognitively and use that part of our brain, we're going to turn to like the limbic system, as you said, to use things to make us feel better, like in the moment right away, because we're not used to dealing with stress in a healthy way to kind of bring ourselves back down to some level of homeostasis.
Yes, exactly. There's a great experiment in rats where if you get a rat addicted to cocaine and the rat learns that it has to press the lever for cocaine, the rat will essentially press that lever till exhaustion or until it dies. But if then you take the cocaine away, it will eventually extinguish that behavior, meaning that the rat will stop pressing the lever because there's no cocaine coming. Then if you wait a year, which is about equivalent to the rat lifetime, foot shock that rat, so put it under enormous stress with a very, very painful physical injury or stimulus, the first thing that rat will do when it's released from the foot shock is run to the lever and start to press it. So you're absolutely right. Stress can sort of reawaken, this kind of primitive urge to seek out something to kind of comfort ourselves.
So wild, but God, I mean, it's scary, but it's helpful at the same time because, at least we have some level of awareness to be able to understand like what's going on fundamentally, so that then we can take some of these steps that you've talked about in order for us to improve our relationship with dopamine and kind of retrain our brain. One of the things that I think people are really struggling with now is their ability to focus, which dopamine, I believe, plays a role in as well. So maybe if you could explain to the audience in the best of your ability, like how does dopamine impact things like focus? And what are some like tips you have for people to like improve their level of focus in a world where people are so distracted?
That's a great question, because I think we're all struggling with this, in the world of distractibility and with this digital content that's so good at capturing and keeping our attention. Part of the reason that we're all becoming less attentive is because we have the ability to reach for a distractor in any moment where we have like a cognitive friction that we have to push against. So let me describe a little bit how that works. Whenever we're engaging in any kind of effortful cognitive task, we will all naturally reach a point of sort of frustration or distress where we would like to stop doing what we're doing. And if we have our phones right there where we can turn to it and start to watch YouTube videos, then, it's a natural that we would want to do that as a kind of relief from having to push against or tolerate sort of the cognitive load or the cognitive distress. And as soon as we do that, we get a hit of dopamine, and that dopamine is then reinforcing, followed again by that dopamine deficit state, which then drives us to want to stay in that place where we're distracted and sort of numbing ourselves and detached. But the problem with that is then we don't develop the kind of mental resilience and in the neural circuits that we need to be able to push through those moments of cognitive friction. So instead, what we need to do is get rid of all of our easy access to these distractors, deleting the apps, putting the phone away, enter into some kind of task that requires sustained attention, knowing that we will maybe almost immediately encounter a speed bump or maybe even a roadblock. And then instead, when that happens, just sit there and say, okay, like my brain is tired, or I don't know how to solve this problem, or I'm not sure how to get through. And don't allow ourselves to escape that cognitive moment. Sit there, breathe, slow it down, and then gird ourselves as we would physically for like a physical thing, like lifting a heavier weight or climbing a mountain or, going across a river, and say, okay, I'm going to now try to start again. And the practice of that, because the brain is a muscle, will make our brains stronger over time. And we will note our ability to push through those moments. So the key is to anticipate that those moments will come, to not get down on ourselves. Also, I think there's a kind of exceptionalism that can occur now where people will say, I have this problem where, I can't pay attention for a sustained period. Other people don't have that problem. It's just me. I have that problem. And yes, it's true. There's a spectrum of ability to pay attention, but trust me, everybody has a problem maintaining their attention and focus on things that are hard to do. Nobody gets a free pass. So for people to sort of, develop that narrative where it's like, I'm the only one who has to deal with it, I worry about that, right? As opposed to normalizing and saying, hey, you know what? Like, my brain got tired after 2 seconds. That's a bummer, but let me just sit here, take a breath, and see if I can start again, or see if that the problem that I can't solve right now, maybe I'll just sit here and maybe it'll come to me, right? Or maybe I need to take a little walk and come back. But what you don't want to do is reach for that source of dopamine that's just going to let you sort of completely get out of that neural circuit that you're trying to strengthen in pursuit of this larger goal.
Yeah, I mean, you said so many things that are so relevant and important for people to hear. And like that one is like retraining your brain, like really taking time to focus and pay attention. And two is like not beating yourself up if you can't do it for as long as you think you could, or for as long as the person next to you, or as long as your neighbor or whatever, and just like accepting that everyone's struggling to pay attention and to be as focused as they once were. And also it's important for people to not fall into that victim mindset, but also like not take the bait and do like what I do when I like can't focus is I'll go on my phone and I'll scroll on Instagram. And that's not like the healthy thing to do with that, because it just defeats the purpose. You end up finding yourself like even less focused, right?
Yeah. And I think one way to attack this problem too is to purposefully set time limits. So again, using time as a construct, and say to yourself, I'm going to set a limit of 30 minutes and I'm going to just focus on this for 30 minutes. And if I find myself distracted, like I'm going to try to notice that I wasn't paying attention and sort of bring myself back. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to let myself do anything else, right? I'm not going to and then at the end of that 30 minutes, give yourself then permission to do something else. Maybe get up from that space where so you create a space that's your quiet focus space, or maybe you have background music. People focus in different ways, but, schedule the time that you're going to be focused, and schedule the time that you're going to let yourself be distracted on Instagram or whatever it is. But also, acknowledging that like creativity and new ideas really do require us to waiting for what arises in our own brains.
Yeah, our best ideas many times come from a place of stillness and quietness when we're not distracted. Last question I want to ask you, and to kind of bring a close to our conversation, it relates back to focus. You talked about like retraining the brain and practicing and being intentional with paying more attention. Are there any like tools that you would recommend for somebody that they could work that would help their focus, like maybe like a coloring book, doing like a crossword puzzle or things like that?
I think that the main thing for learning and maintaining focus is what I call self-binding strategies, which is using time or categories or actual physical barriers between ourselves and our drugs of choice, our easy distractors, so that we can press the pause button between desire and consumption. If I'm sitting here trying to focus and like my drug is right next to me, let's say a bag of potato chips, or, easy access to a YouTube video, or any of the number of things that I like to do that are pure pleasure for me. If they're right there, I'm human, right? How am I not going to reach for that? So really acknowledging the ways in which we're all vulnerable, and that you have to really create this world within a world, and you have to do it in a premeditated, intentional way in advance in order to hope to have a chance to be able to sit with sustained attention and not become, go to that other thing. So I think that kind of pre-planning and anticipating and then creating a space that works for you, whatever that may be, in order to be able to sit there, and intentionally. So in a way, what that's about is like not expecting yourself to be not human. It's acknowledging that we're all human and vulnerable in this way, and then doing yourself a favor by creating an environment that allows you to reach your goal.